for North Island Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So today I'm here to speak to Bill C-92, which deals with an important issue, especially to my riding of North Island Powell River, of Indigenous children in care. I want to just take a moment to thank all of the local Indigenous communities and organizations that represent First Nations, Inuit, and Métis groups and communities in my riding for the hard work that they do every day for the children that they represent. You know, in Indigenous communities, children are sacred. I think of some of the communities I represent, and I think of the elder Elsie Paul, who talked to me about how children are seen as a gift from the Creator given to the community to raise. And when that child is taken, what that means to the community. I think about Alberta Billy, another elder in another Indigenous community that I represent, that talked to me about the impact of colonization and residential school on the community. And said to me, imagine your community right now and remove every child from the ages of 4 to 16 from the community tomorrow and see how the community reacts and responds. So I think of those elders who have watched their communities struggle through the challenges of colonization, residential school, the 60 Scoop, and many more challenges, and how hard that has been on those communities. I also think we need to look at the numbers, and I have some of them here for us today. 112 years ago, Dr. Bryce, a medical health officer, linked federal health funding inequities to preventable deaths of First Nations children. 112 years ago. 73 years ago, child welfare experts called for increasing family support to reduce the number of First Nations children in state care. And I think this speaks to something really important that we still have not done in this country, which is prevention and support for those communities. 38 years ago, experts called on then INAC to resolve jurisdictional disputes resulting in service denials to First Nations children. 12 years ago, the Assembly of First Nations and Caring Society filed the human rights case against Canada. And the number of Auditor General reports, 2 of them, confirming child welfare funding inequity since 2008. 165,000 plus First Nations children affected by Canada's discriminatory services. 25 million approximate number of nights of First Nations children spent in foster care since 2007. These numbers are startling, and they tell us a story that all of us should be concerned about in this country. 7, the number of Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders requiring Canada to cease its discrimination during this Parliament since 2016 in January. How many of these Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders have Canada fully complied with? That number is 0. 0. So I think whenever we stand in this place and we speak about Indigenous children in this country, we must always remember and acknowledge Jordan River Anderson, a Cree child from Norway House Cree Nation who died in Manitoba in 2005 at the age of 5 after the Manitoba and federal government spent years fighting over who would have to pay for his home care. This speaks to the very core of this issue. It's about valuing Indigenous children and the communities that love them. And this young boy died as a result of discussions between 2 levels of government about who's going to fork over the money. Nobody wants to know that this is the truth of how their child is going to be treated. So I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge that precious, sacred child, a gift from the Creator that should have been supported and looked after by the whole community, which also includes the country of Canada, and the family that worked so hard to support that child and had to meet that terrible end. We cannot forget. Today, there are 3 times as many Indigenous children in government care than during the peak of residential school times. The conditions and outcomes for kids in care today are often tragic, and many experts are saying that the modern fallout of the Child and Family Services program is now going to be called the Millennium Scoop. That is devastating. It shows that the history of this country is repeating itself, and that is unacceptable. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the many artists out there in this country, Indigenous artists that have spoken to these issues, be it through art, through poetry, through music. We can't begin to recognize what this has done to that culture, to the Indigenous culture of the Métis, the First Nations, and Inuit people across this country. I would like to take this opportunity to share a quote from some members of the Haisla Nation. I can't remember my name. 500 years my people have been humble. 500 years we've dealt with the struggle. 500 more years for all of my young ones. For 500 years we've been drumming and drumming. So as we're here in this important place where important decisions are made that will have long-term impacts on the people that the decisions are made about, we have to just acknowledge that it is too bad that this government waited so long to introduce this bill, and now we're rushing through it. And that's hard for me, because I take this really seriously. I've spoken about this in this House, and I've spoken about it in the committee in my role as Vice Chair, about being a foster parent on a reserve, about the hard work that we did in the community to try to keep the children at home, connected to their culture. You know, I think of my husband who's taken foster children in our community out to the river when their voices are changing, the young men, because we want to keep them connected to that tradition, that when you have that change of age, that you do the hard work and you go out and you get the support of the community to do the sacred baths. So here we are rushing, and we're trying to get it done because Indigenous children need action. But I just want to say that in the rushing process, I am a little afraid that we're not going to get it right, that we're going to get it done, but we're not going to get it right. And I have to say that I believe that Indigenous children in this country deserve much, much better. You know, earlier I mentioned the two Auditor General reports on the failure of the Canadian governments and the First Nation children for the First Nation children in care. In 2008, the Auditor General report found that since 1990, when the Child and Family Services Program was created, INAC had given money, quote, to First Nations, their child welfare agencies, and provinces to cover the operating costs of child welfare services on reserve and the costs related to bringing to children brought into care, end quote. The Auditor General also concluded that as of 2008, quote, the funding INAC provides is not based on the actual cost of delivering those services. It is based on a funding formula that the department applies nationwide. The formula dates from 1988. It has not been changed to reflect the variations in legislation and in child welfare services from province to province or the actual number of children in care, end quote. This really speaks to a systemic issue. It speaks to the reality that Indigenous children have been left behind and not valued. And not only have the children been left behind, but the value and the preventative support that families and communities desperately needed were not a priority. Mr. Speaker, this country knows its history. We know the colonial history. We know the devaluation of Indigenous members of this country. We know the history of trying to destroy in multiple ways those communities. I have to say that if you break it, you have to pay for it. And one of the things that concerns me greatly in this legislation is the principles for funding are not in the actual legislation. There's a small mention about funding, but it is not anything that I think will be strong enough. This is a framework legislation. It's supposed to create something that is strong enough to hold that legislation that Indigenous communities bring forward. If the resources are not there, this will be another failure. We will have another Auditor General's report that tells us that this is still not being addressed. In 2011, again, the Auditor General reported that, quote, despite the federal government's many efforts to implement our recommendations and improve its First Nations programs, we have seen a lack of progress in improving the lives and well-being of people living on reserves. Services available on reserves are often not comparable to those provided off reserve by provinces and municipalities. Conditions on reserves have remained poor. Change is needed if First Nations are to experience more meaningful outcomes from the services they receive. You know, years have gone by. We are now sitting here in a parliament where there was a Human Rights Tribunal decision made in 2016. The government of the day received 7 non-compliance orders, and we're here tonight talking about this legislation. And I am concerned because the proof is in the action, and I don't see that action. And what I am most concerned about is the resources required to actually deal with this systemic issue, to realize that the racism and discrimination is built right into the system, and to pull that out takes a lot of work and a lot of resources. And if we want to make a difference for Indigenous community, if we want to honor First Nations communities, and Inuit communities, Métis communities, we have to see those resources finally there. So the tribunal, the Human Rights Tribunal in Canada, concluded that then INAC's delivery of services and funding as service was inferior to comparable provincial services and discriminatory on the basis of race, and ordered the government to make up the funding gap and implement Jordan's Principle. As of June 2017, this government has spent $707,000 fighting against this decision. And I think that's really sad. And so when we look at this legislation that we're discussing, C-92, it's like history is repeating itself. So I'm going to support this legislation. I am going to trust that the Indigenous communities across this country are going to do their hard work. And I want to recognize as well that there are Indigenous communities, like the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, that have been very clear that they do not support this legislation. And I've asked the committee to recognize that and make sure that Indigenous communities have the right to opt out, but they still get the resources that they desperately need to make a difference. So, you know, that is still not addressed in this legislation, and that needs to be addressed. It is time for substantive change, and it's good to speak about it, but it's important that we act on it as well. So this bill does set national standards, but has numerous question marks and gaps that are outstanding, including accountability, jurisdiction, data collection and reporting, and most critically, funding. The bill leaves funding to negotiating between Canada, Indigenous groups, and the provinces, meaning that it could vary widely. You know, for me, as the member of North Island Powell River, I represent small Indigenous communities. And often they are very remote and have a lot of challenges that they specifically are facing. I want to make sure, and I don't know that this legislation is going to do it, but I will be watching it and continuing to propose solutions, because those small communities have very, very big challenges, and the capacity can be very hard for them to gather. And we want to make sure that those communities have a voice at this table. We want to make sure that they have a process that they can move forward in and have faith in. And there is some concern that those resources will not be there. You know, a lot of people came and they talked about a lot of issues. And I will say in front of everyone in this House that a vast majority of the witnesses expressed concern. They wanted to see funding principles right in the legislation. We were not successful in getting that amendment in. So this is something we will all be watching for very closely. You know, I think that the government was given an opportunity to support funding provisions that nearly every witness who appeared for the committee agreed with. And what we saw was half measures. So I will express my concern on that and let the government know that I will be watching for this, that we will be talking to communities and making sure that they're seeing the progress that this government is assuring us is going to happen. Because we need to see that progress. Enough is enough. You know, when we look at the lives of children, these are children. They deserve the right to be children. And when they don't have the resources or the home that they desperately need, we are taking away their right to be a child. You know, Ms. Natasha Reamer, the founder of Foster Up, spoke to us during the committee, and she said, yes, I think funding is a key component. Without adequate funding, services, and resources, we are failing these children and youth in care. We leave them unsupported and unable to thrive and reach their full potential. I think it's crucial that we have legislation ensuring that there is funding allocated for this and that these resources are given the utmost that we could possibly give, because these are children's lives that we're talking about. They deserve an opportunity. They are kids at the end of the day. I think it's sad how many children have a history in this country of not being allowed to be children. And we heard some of that testimony. We had children who had spent great portions of their childhood in care. And they talked about the challenges. They talked about how hard it was to go home, how they didn't know who they were, how hard it was to figure out who to connect with and when to connect with them. We had witnesses that had multiple nations that they were from, not knowing which one to go to and who to go first and how. So when we look at the system, we can see how broken it is, because we saw those witnesses that came and talked about their addiction issues, and one person came with testimony about the challenges that he faced and how hard he had to work to become a parent because he didn't know. So I think it's important that in this place we recognize that that falls on this place's shoulders, because decisions were made here. So this decision has to be made. It has to be made respectfully, because those children deserve it. Naomi Metallic from the Yellowhood Institute said, "This funding is intertwined with jurisdiction because really, if there is no funding and accountability built into this act, what this bill will do is merely provide Indigenous people with the jurisdiction to legislate over their own poverty." You know, this was another issue that came up, was how many children are taken away from their community because they don't have the resources, the basic necessities to provide for their child, and that should never happen. But that doesn't mean we should leave children in substandard housing. It means that this place has to take responsibility and look at how they can become an ally. You know, this is still an issue. We still don't know where the Indigenous plan is for housing. I think that's absolutely devastating in this day and age. You know, another thing that really concerned me was the best interest of the child. That has been defined by court systems across Canada, both provincially and federally. You know, in the community I married into, Hamalko First Nation, when I had my children with my husband, I was told that the relationship between the parent and the child is deemed completely sacred, that nothing should ever interfere in that loving relationship. So in that community, the historic practice was that aunties and uncles were in charge of disciplining the child, because they didn't want to interfere ever with the parent's ability to just love that kid up. And so there's ways that things are done. And so making sure that that is recognized is important. And I want to thank the National Chief from the Assembly of First Nations, who said the best interest of the child sections should be amended to clarify that First Nations governing bodies that pass laws prescribing the factors for determining the best interest of the child will add to the factors of the bill, creating recognition and support for our ways of caring for our children and families. This is important because of some of our people, we do not remove the child, we remove the person harming the child and keep the family intact. We believe that this is in the best interest of the child. Our laws must be affirmed and our practices supported to preserve family unity. So when we are sitting in this place, we must understand that Indigenous communities do it differently. And I quite frankly think that we have a lot to learn from that. What concerns me is this legislation is not clear enough to make sure that that definition is defined in those communities. It's been defined already in the court systems in this country, and that could be a serious concern, and I don't think that that was addressed as clearly as it could. So I know my time is ending. So I just want to take this opportunity again to recognize the First Peoples of this place, to recognize the Indigenous communities, the First Nations, the Inuit and Métis, and say that it is with great sorrow that we are here today debating this, because this should not be what's happening. The history of Canada is a shameful one, and like my granny said, you have to make it right. You have to make it right. So I will support this bill. And I look forward to continuing to work hard in the future to make it right. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This bill, is so important, and there was discussion about the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, and when I was reading their bill that they proposed, really actually presents an entirely different worldview. But this bill, C-92, that we have before us, is going to allow a lot more leeway for that worldview to shine forth. And in the reading of the bill from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, it talks about ceremony. It is about an interconnected, holistic nature of the Indigenous philosophy, which, perhaps you won't find in federal legislation too much, but which is extremely important in how Indigenous peoples traditionally viewed the world. And I hope, my comment to the House Leader as this bill moves to its final stages through the Senate is that when it does come to royal assent, when the Governor-General will give her assent to this bill, that ceremony plays an important role, because I know the bill that was developed by the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs was developed in ceremony. It was developed through prayer. It was developed through the use of the pipe and a great amount of spirituality and the use of the drum. And this might sound strange in this place in how we do legislation here, but it was extremely important to the people of Manitoba and of the people who developed their bill in their way, and they wanted to go forward. So I hope the government will be able to find an additional accommodation at the royal assent stage to know that this bill is also imbued and full of the spirit of all Canadians in that coming together in the belief that our children really do matter.
North Island Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his comment. I didn't hear a question in that. But I will say, in the riding that I represent, like I said, I represent over 20 Indigenous communities with varying cultures and practices. And it's been an honor for me to spend some time with those communities and learn. And I think of Hillemis Henderson, who is an elder of mine in the northern part of Vancouver Island. And he always talks about the children and the care of the children and the importance of the children knowing where they come from, understanding the history of where they come from. I think about my husband, and we go when we're in his territory, and he can point out a mountain and say, that's where we harvested this. That's where all of this family went. And my children know that. They know where they come from, so they're not confused as they go. I think about, ceremony. It is very important. I think of my children who, both of my sons every day went to the river and they bathed in the river for a year when their voices changed. It changes who they are. They know who they are. They become firm in themselves because they've challenged themselves and they've found themselves connected to the planet that they live on and the area that they come from. So I do think it would be beautiful in this place if we started to look at some of those rationales. I think about being in the Namgis Nation and dealing with conflict, where the big house, they don't let you out. You stay in that place. The elders support you, and you work out those conflicts, and you leave together. And I would love to see a place where we left together and talked to each other in a more honorable way. So I look forward to that in this place one day.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Souris Moose Mountain.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for North Island Powell River for her presentation. And in my riding, I have 7 First Nations, and one of those First Nations is Cowessess First Nation. And Chief Cadmus DeLorme, he actually was here just last week, but I've got to know him a number of times, and he's done, plus his predecessors, have done tremendous work with this First Nation. They've built windmills that are producing megawatts to the SAS power system. They've put in great solar panels as well to further to that. But just in the past week, they've actually brought forward a youth transition home for 10 girls between the ages of 14 and 17, and allowing these 10 girls to come back to the First Nation to live and to care for them. And I'm just wondering if the member, through you, Mr. Speaker, she can say to us and tell us how she sees C-92 will be a benefit.
North Island Powell River.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his important question, and I recognize the hard work of that community in his riding that's doing so much work to move forward. And I think that we don't hear those stories enough, to be quite honest. There's a lot of Indigenous communities. I think of the Métis Association in the North Island in my riding, who, you know, is a small but mighty group of people that just keeps working hard to connect their Métis children to their traditions. And, you know, that is really important work. So I look at this legislation and I'm hopeful. I'm just cautious, and I think most Indigenous communities in this country are cautious because there is a history that is not very positive. So, you know, I hope that this will provide the supports. I think what is most important is that the resources are there to make sure that the processes can be looked at, and that there is room for that innovation. But the resources need to be there. It's great that that house is going up to bring 10 young women back home. But if you don't have the resources to pay for basic housing needs, it's really hard to take that next step. So this is what needs to be looked at. And again, I will come back to what I said in my speech, which is if you break it, which we all in this place have to understand that Canada broke it. You know, I think about all of the different nations that I've gone and spoke to and their traditions and how they used to do it and how they're working really hard to bring that back, but they're facing monumental challenges because of the trauma that's been passed on generation to generation to generation. So that preventative resource needs to be there too. It would be great to see children not leaving because we're supporting the families, supporting the nations and supporting the families to do a better job in terms of parenting, because it's all there. It is all there. We just need to finally pay for what we broke. Thank you.
Before I go to questions and comments, I just want to comment, if any of you have a phone, everyone has a phone or a gadget that is electronic, just check it to make sure it mutes. I don't know what it is today, but I've had a few of them while I've been sitting. So I just want to make sure that, and I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, it happens to the best of us. Just check it out, make sure it's muted. Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Cowichan Malahat Langford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, as I stand in this place, I think of the Liaxin, the Halalt, the Penelakut, the Malahat, the Pachidat, the Dididat, and of course Cowichan tribes. And what a great honor it is for me to stand in this place and be their voice, because they too, I represent many communities on Vancouver Island, a bit farther south than my colleague, but they are going through the same kind of pain. And it's well past time that we address this issue. You know, I find that the memory of this place can be short sometimes, and I'm glad that my colleague in the course of her speech raised the issue of Jordan's Principle, because it was back in 2007 that my former boss, Gene Crowder, who represented the riding of Nanaimo Cowichan at the time, brought forward motion 296 at the time, which was passed unanimously by this House, which confirmed Jordan's Principle. So the point I'm trying to get across is that this House of Commons has already had opportunities in the past to voice its opinion on the issue. It's not like these are new issues. And I share my colleagues' saying concerns that we are stuck in this place where we want to see this bill move forward, but we do have concerns that it may be rushed. And just looking at the timeline of this government, it's too bad that here we are with 3 weeks left that we're just getting to this stage now. Anyways, it's more of a comment, Mr. Speaker. If my honourable colleague from North Island Powell River can just talk about, you know, how this House in the past has had lots of opportunities, not just in this Parliament, to address these issues. And it's a shame that, you know, with children being our most precious resource, that again we seem to be in this place with all the power that we command, having to ask First Nations communities to just wait a little bit longer for what is certainly a very overdue and long deserved attention to the matters that matter most to them. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for North Island Powell River.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for that important comment. You know, one of the things I know from the teachings of the family that I've married into is that when you name something, you're giving it power. So the fact that we have Jordan's Principle, it's not just a name to recognize this precious child. It is an obligation. when you name something like that, you're not only giving the name to recognize, you're also giving the name so that when people hear that name, they remember the obligation and the commitment. It's a way of witnessing, of remembering, and always bringing that back. So I want to thank the people who've gone before, who've worked so hard on this, that finally came with Jean Crowder's amazing work to bring that forward. But the history is a painful one, and rebuilding trust. You know, I was listening to a podcast with Brene Brown, and it was talking about trust is built on the small things repetitively done faithfully and honestly. And I think about that. You know, if you look at the history in this country, it has not been so. There's not been a government in this place yet where the commitments have been cumulative and they keep going, and the action is taken now, not asking Indigenous communities to wait. So, you know, I look forward to this legislation. I hope it brings the best, because that's what I want to see. I want to see the best for our children. They certainly are worth it. But the concern is, will it happen? Will the funding and resources be there? Will the court system understand that the best interest of the child definition is something that has been redefined, and they actually use that when they're making their decisions? These are the things we will be watching for, and these are the things that must happen for the trust to be built. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have to state from the get-go what a privilege it is to sit with a member on the Indigenous Committee. I have a deep respect for her passion, and she has a beautiful heart when it comes to Indigenous issues. And I just wanted to state that first, Mr. Speaker. She knows my position on the bill is that I find that the beauty of this bill, the elegance of this bill is that it is a framework. It is a starting place, and that the ending place being that Indigenous communities will finally will establish their own legislation when it comes to child and family services. And what I find the most powerful thing about this bill is that that their own legislation will have precedence, will have paramountcy over federal and provincial governments. And I just wanted to ask the member if she would agree that through you, Mr. Speaker, of course, that she would agree that that this is a very powerful part of the bill itself.
The Honourable Member for North Island of Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member. I also enjoy working with him in the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee. I find him attentive, and I appreciate that dedication. I think this is a step in the right direction. I don't know that it goes as far as I would hope it would go. You know, one of the things that I think is important when we're discussing this legislation is the details. So in one of the communities that I represent, you know, they made a decision many years ago, and their decision was that the community would come together, they would raise the funds, and they would build in their community a church and a school. And that meant they had to give up their culture. They had to give up a lot of their practices because they were inviting the church and the school right into their community. And they had the last potlatch right before the church had the nuns and the priests come, and they were also the teachers in the school. They did their last potlatch, and they knew they were giving it away. They were giving away their culture. But the reason they did that was so that their children would stay in their care until grade 6, and then they would go to residential school. It gave that community a few more years with their children. So when you look at that community and their development, figuring out how their culture is going to move forward is a challenge. They're having to go out and relearn their culture because they gave it up for their children. So when you look at building this legislation, that community needs the resources to do that part of the work. Because if they're going to build legislation that is going to really allow them to do that, they need to go back. And that costs money. It's resources. But if we're going to do this right, if we're going to honor that process, if we're going to acknowledge that a decision was made in that community to give up their culture so they could have their children, we need to honor that with the resources to do the work.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Sarnia Lambton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for North Island Powell River for, as always, an excellent and thoughtful speech. When I've listened to the debate, it appears to me that there are different First Nations and Indigenous places that are ready to take over the governance of the children, and there are places that are far from that. There appears to be no funding and no plan. And so to introduce this legislation in the dying days of this government is sort of like virtue signaling if you can't really execute it. And so I wonder if the member could comment on whether she believes the legislation as it's written could actually be put in place.
The Honourable Member for North Island Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for that really important question. And I have to say that a lot of Indigenous communities have come forward and are really encouraging all of us in this place to make sure that this is legislation that moves quickly, because they want to see that progress happen. They want to see the discussions happening. And you know, there is some concern, actually, and I will be frank with the member, and I respect her, and I hope she doesn't take this the wrong way, that a lot of concern that I've heard from communities, not only in my riding, but across Canada, is if the Conservatives get in, there will be concern about that actually being negotiated. And I think that's sad and something for all of us to address in this House at some point. So my concern, and I share it with her, is how is this going to happen rapidly enough? You know, we're going into an election. We need to see this happen. Indigenous children deserve the best because they have been given for generations the very least. And so I will be working hard in whatever role that I play in this country to make sure that this is done, and it's done well, because the children of this country deserve it. And there is challenges with capacity, and we need to see that acknowledged. And again, it will be in how the implementation of this bill happens if we see it actually addressed meaningfully. Thank you.